For our last session this evening, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Mary Honeyball. As I've mentioned before when I was introducing the event, my own research is on women in the Labour Party 1945 to 1979. And my kind of subtitle is It's Not Just Jenny Lee and Barbara Castle. And I was really astonished there wasn't a good biography of Edith Summerskill. In the same way, and Helen and I have talked about this before, that I'm really astonished there isn't a good biography of Irene Ward. And I'm also really interested in Mary as kind of part of a tradition of Labour women who are interested in Labour women's history. So I'm thinking here of people like Nan Sloan and also more recently Rachel Reeves, who are actually kind of really helping to rewrite the history of their own party. Mary is a former Labour MEP who's represented London from 2000 until 2019. She was the Labour representative in the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee in the European Parliament, where she carried out extensive work on human trafficking and sex work. She was the Socialist and Democrat group coordinator on the Parliament's Culture and Education Committee, and she has expertise in intellectual property and copyright law. So she is the author of Parliamentary Pioneers, Labour Women MPs 1918 to 1945, and she's now taken that work further into the 20th century with her new biography on Edith Summerskill. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you'll join me in making Mary very welcome.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you about Edith Summerskill. I obviously lived with Edith for about 3 years, writing the biography, and as Lindsay has said, I was inspired myself to do this sort of work because there is such a gap. It's more than a gap, it's practically non-existent history of women in politics in general, and really the Labour Party should know better than that because there are now more Labour women MPs than men, and the party has got a long tradition of working on equality. So for me, I was a history graduate many years ago, and writing about, once I stopped doing the full-time work, about women in the Labour Party seemed a very obvious thing to do, and it's been great. I mean, I've learnt so much doing this, and I've also got a copy of it, obviously, which I'm very, very proud to and privileged to have done. It is, as Lindsay said, the first biography of Edith Summerskill, and I don't know either why there hasn't been an earlier one, because she was so prominent during her life. She was in the media all the time, particularly during the war and immediately afterwards, at the time of the Attlee government. She wrote her own memoirs, and she wrote several other things, including a book about boxing, which I'll come to later, which was one of her main interests later in life. But earlier, she wrote a book called Babies Without Tears about maternity provision. So she was a very public figure at her time, and just seemed to have been, until recently, completely airbrushed from history. Most people, unless they're of her age group, have never heard of her. Older women that I talked to in the Labour Party actually knew Edith because they'd seen her at conferences and events and therefore had heard of her. But people my age and younger really haven't. I'm sure you're honourable exceptions because you study these things, but people who don't study these things just hadn't known at all about Edith. So I embarked on this project, and I know you'll be interested in sources. I wouldn't say this for every audience, but it was made possible, actually, by the fact that Edith's son, she also had children, which was very rare for the few women Labour politicians at this time. She had 2 children, Michael and Shirley. Shirley Summerskill is actually still alive. She's 91, she may be 92 now. Obviously very frail, but she also became an MP. But it was Michael, the son, who collected together a lot of papers on on Edith, and wrote some stuff himself as well. It's all in the LSE library, and I think if I hadn't had access to that, I would have found this a very daunting project indeed, because there's very little actually written about her. She doesn't feature in the major diarists of the time. You don't find her in Richard Crossman or Barbara Castle or Ian McArdle or any of them. She doesn't feature in any of the later biographies of leading politicians of the time. It's as if she wasn't there. So finding anything, apart from quite modern stuff, there's a chapter in the book, Making Reputations, and there's also a bit about her in Women Contesting Home Defence. But that is it. So I think to have put this together without Michael Summerskill's papers would have been very difficult indeed. Michael's been dead for a while now, but his son, Ben, who you probably all heard of, used to run Stonewall. Ben was very helpful with this and gave me quite a lot of insight. And Edith's life from the very beginning was a bit unusual. Her father was a doctor. She was born in 1901. Her father was a doctor. She was born in Bloomsbury, and she was the youngest. None of this is particularly unusual. It gets more unusual as we go through it. She was the youngest of 3 children. She had a brother also called William after the father, who's Dr. William Summerskill. The son also became Dr. William Summerskill, and Edith became obviously a medical doctor as well. The sister Daphne didn't. And one thing that's very interesting about the 3 of them, they were all slightly involved in politics, not to the extent Edith was, but the 2 children, the son, William Jr., fought a seat for the Liberal Democrats, the Liberals as they were then, in the 1930s, and the sister Daphne married a doctor and actually was active in the Conservative Association in Leytonstone. So it's quite interesting that they all took different political positions. What's also quite interesting later on is that the 3 doctors, the father, the son and Edith, all had entries in the medical register in Harley Street. Different premises in Harley Street was also quite unusual. But, and the mother, of course, Dr. Summerskill Senior's mother, obviously didn't work outside the home, and it was exhausting because Dr. William was, as I will call him from now on, though that doesn't help very much since they were both called William, but the senior one was single-handed general practitioner, and I think that was very difficult. But what was even more difficult for the mother, and this is an extraordinary story, and I've had it confirmed by both Michael's papers in the library and by Ben Summerskill. Dr. Summerskill Senior was, the words that they used in the sources, a philanderer. I think it was probably a bit more than that because it was very serious infidelity, and I suspect there was actually some level of abuse within it. I base that on the fact that I have read something in Michael's papers saying that the Summerskill household, Dr. Summerskill's senior household, Edith grew up, they only employed maids with some level of learning disability because they would be left alone by Dr. William. I mean, that's just how bad it was. And another awful part of this story is that there were children from these liaisons. I mean, you'd have thought that a guy who was a doctor, even at that time, might have been able to prevent it, but he obviously chose not to. And he paid them some level of support for the children, which you may think is quite a good thing. But the point about it is that in order to collect this money, they used to come to the Summerskill household, and Mrs. Summerskill, also called Edith, the wife, actually paid these women money for the upkeep of the illegitimate children. And I think this, I mean, Edith must have known about this because it actually took place at the back door of the house. I can't imagine that a young woman, a girl growing up in these circumstances would not have known that this was going on. And I think this is one of the main reasons that Edith actually became such a feminist and took up the cause of women, because she'd seen this kind of thing going on for herself and understood actually what it meant and why it was so important to give women more rights than they had at this time. So she... And I think it's quite interesting with a lot of politicians do have something like this in their background, and she most certainly did. However, having said that about her father, he did encourage her to take up medicine, and he used to take her on his rounds, first of all, in first instance on horseback, though I think that changed a bit later. And she tells a story which is quite well known, actually, but I think it's worth quoting again because it just shows really how bad conditions were then. She says once on her, this is in 1947, this is a bit later, after she qualified, she then went as a doctor on rounds with her father, and she says, and this is a quote from her memoirs, at the age of 22, a newly qualified doctor, I went to attend my first confinement. My knock was answered by a young husband, pallid and shabby, with the familiar signs of long unemployment on him. He took me upstairs. There lay the patient, a girl my own age in labour with her second child. By the bed stood a cot, and standing, grasping the wooden bars, was a child with a bulging forehead and crooked legs, the classic picture of rickets. In that room, that night, I became a socialist. I joined the fight, not against a class, but against a system. She wrote that in 1947 in The Listener, and it obviously goes back to the time when she recently qualified in the mid-1920s, and is an indication of just how bad things were there then. Anyway, Edith did go on to King's College and Charing Cross Hospital. They had quite a peripatetic life. The Summerskills had moved around quite a bit before this time, but they finally settled in Lewisham. Edith actually went to Eltham Girls' School, and then, as I said, on to medical school. And she continued, of course, to live with her parents, because everybody did then. Quite a different world. And there's a lovely story in her memoirs about how her father, this is, the age that 18, 19, when we happily went off to interviews on our own, but her father took her, and she was wearing basically her school uniform, a long gym slip and thick woolen tights and her hair in plaits. I mean, it just is an evocative image of a completely different world. And she qualified in 1925, having met a couple of years before that Geoffrey Samuel, who was also a medical student at Charing Cross, and they later went on to get married after Edith had qualified. And they first went to they both went into general practice. Geoffrey was amazingly supportive throughout her life. He was really the person she depended on. But there's a little bit of a hint at this time when they were deciding what to do with their medical treatment, their medical qualifications. Geoffrey may have wanted to take up psychiatry, then very much in its infancy, but Edith wanted to do general practice, which is what he agreed to do. And they went to Wood Green, and they became very quickly doctors to the poor. They were known as the sixpenny doctors. And in the sources, in the papers, there's letters written much later to Michael Summerskill saying, from people who remembered Edith, how wonderful it was and how good she was with children. She had a creche in her surgery, and how she was really caring. I mean, she obviously was a very an excellent doctor who really, really cared about her patients. The two children I mentioned were born, Michael in 1927 and Shirley in 1931. As I said, Shirley's alive, Michael died a few years ago. Edith, as soon as the children were born, this is very much a sign of the time, she engaged a nanny, which might not sound too unusual, but the nanny lived in was absolutely part of their lives and the children's lives. And when Edith died, the nanny lived with them all her life. And when Edith died, the nanny then moved to live with Shirley, Edith's daughter. I mean, that's how close it was. And I think it was the nanny known as Nana who allowed Edith to do a lot of things that she did do, because she had childcare that was there all the time that she absolutely could trust. And I think that's quite an interesting reflection of what women throughout the time they've been in Parliament have needed, that sort of help and support. Obviously you have to have childcare, and childcare you can trust. And it does mean that certainly at this time, and I think for much longer, you needed a certain income level to keep that up. And don't forget, MPs weren't paid particularly much at this point. So they've had both become doctors, and this is the time when Edith began to get involved in politics. She was actually approached by the medical officer in Wood Green, the Wood Green Urban District Council, asking her if she'd like to be on the co-opted member on the Maternal and Child Welfare Committee of the Urban District Council, which she did do, and that was her real entry into politics. She later became a member of Middlesex County Council, which was a Conservative council, and she stayed on Middlesex County Council until the 1940s. After she'd become an MP, she continued doing the two jobs. Also at this time, during the 1930s, she started to do quite a few things which may be expected for aspiring Labour politicians of the time. She became very involved in the campaign around the Spanish Civil War, and she was involved in medical aid to Spain in the 1930s. And she actually visited Spain in 1938, just after she'd become an MP, and they'd asked her, because she'd been involved in the Spanish Medical Aid Committee before. So Spain was very much part, as it was with a lot of people on the left at this time, very much part of her politics and what she did. She also, and I think this is quite interesting, she was also a member of the Eugenics Society, because she did a lot of work on birth control and contraception, and she ran a birth control clinic in Wood Green, and which she didn't charge much, if anything, for, and also one in Harley Street, which helped subsidise giving medical care to poor people. But Mary Stopes was also a member of the Eugenics Society, and birth control was quite an important part of what the Eugenics Society at this time did. And eugenics was respectable. There was a professorship, I think still at this time, at UCL in eugenics. And it just, to modern ears, it just sounds a bit, it's not quite right somehow. But of course then it was very different. And I do think when you're doing a biography particularly, you do need to judge these things by the views and morality of the time, not by your own or your own time. Edith went on to fight a parliamentary seat in Putney in a by-election in 1934. And actually the frontispiece of my book is a photograph that was taken of her an election address. I mean, she was 33 at the time, and very unusual, very young for a woman, and she was striking looking, and her looks, as always happens with women, her looks were commented throughout her career. And then she fought Bury, the parliamentary seat in the north of England, in Lancashire, for the 1935 general election. And there's a story about her here which is well known. It's one of the things that people do seem to have remembered about her, possibly because she talked about it a lot. But Bury was quite a Roman Catholic area, and there were a couple of Catholic priests who came to see Edith when she was fighting the campaign and told her that she didn't talk publicly about contraception and birth control, but people knew about what she did and how she felt about it and her work on birth control. So the Catholic priest came to her and said, unless you disavow what you say on birth control, if you say that you're not going to support it and do it any longer, unless you do that, we will not support you. We'll make sure that all our parishioners don't vote for you. And Edith actually stood her ground and said, right, okay, well, birth control is what I do and what I believe in. I will go on doing what I am doing, and we'll see what happens. And in actual fact, she did lose, but Labour lost the 1935 election anyway, and it's debatable how much it made difference it made electorally. It might have made a difference, but probably not enough that would have meant a difference between winning and losing the seat. She got into Parliament in 1938 in another by-election in Fulham West, and this was an election fought at the time of appeasement, and appeasement was one of the big issues. The Labour Party had changed its policy by this time, and it was anti-appeasement and taking the view that Britain should stand up to Hitler by force if necessary. And so she actually won the by-election, and it was a marginal seat. It was very marginal at this time. It had been Conservative, so maybe the appeasement campaign had actually made a difference. And so Edith arrived in Parliament in 1938. Only one of 10, there were 10 women MPs, one woman for every 60 men, which gives you an idea of how difficult it was for women then. And she did face, there's no doubt about it, there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of misogyny. I want to tell you this, I think this is a really funny story. Nancy Astor, who was already a Conservative Member of Parliament by this time, who never got on with Winston Churchill at all, and Winston Churchill actually didn't want to know Nancy Astor. He would cut her in the corridor and not speak to her. And Nancy Astor, being Nancy Astor, asked Winston Churchill when she had an opportunity why he had cut her like that. And Churchill retorted, when you, Nancy Astor and women, came into the house, I felt you had entered my bathroom and I had no sponge with which to defend myself. And Astor then replied to Churchill, you're not handsome enough to have worries of that kind, which I just thought was a really nice story. Edith wanted to continue using her maiden name, which was unheard of, and she had a great problem with it, and she talked to Stafford Cripps, who was one of the Labour members who dealt with this sort of thing in 1938. And she again had a very good story to tell about this, because Cripps just didn't know what to do about it, and he really preferred her to use her married name. And Edith said to Stafford Cripps, if the General Medical Council considered I am competent to undertake professional work calling for a high sense of responsibility without changing my name or marriage, why should parliamentarians be more obdurate? Then she went on to say that she was perfectly qualified to sign a death certificate in her maiden name. Therefore, why couldn't she use her maiden name in the House of Commons? And she did. They just sort of gave in. And she had actually fought the other elections using her maiden name. And she was the first woman MP to call herself a feminist. There were other women MPs who actually did who were women, but none, obviously there were, but not very many. But none of them have really taken up the cause of women's suffrage and women's rights in the way that Edith did. The only one who had MP at the time who had any sort of interest in this was Eleanor Rathbone, who stood as an independent. And she and Edith worked well together. And that was the start of a long partnership which saw things like family allowances actually being introduced. Edith founded at this time the Married Women's Association with her friend Juanita Francis. And this was important for Edith because the Married Women's Association, during most of the years she was an MP, actually worked for her, did research, made sure that she understood what she was doing, and it was very much part of her sort of structure of doing the job, and it went on for very, very many years. 1941, Edith wrote Babies Without Tears, which really became her personal manifesto. I mean, that's what she was going to do. She was going to do things for women, improve maternity services. A lot of Babies Without Tears, as it suggests, is like analgesia and childbirth, which is a big campaign of hers. And another thing which was interesting about the women MPs at this time is that they had a lot fewer problems with cross-party working than the men did. There was a room for them, the lady members' room, which was down in the basement somewhere. It was tiny and they couldn't all fit in it, even though there were only 10 of them. But they saw each other cross-party, and it broke down some of the barriers and was probably very useful. Certainly it was useful when it came to the Second World War, when obviously there was a coalition government. Edith by now had had a couple of years in Parliament and began to know what she wanted to do and the way that Parliament worked. So what we see her during the war doing, she obviously didn't have any position by this time, but what she did do was take up various campaigns, and some to do with the war, some not to do with the war. Again, something she's quite well known for, she's known for anything at all, was trying to get women recognised in the Home Guard, which I think, I've always thought was a rather strange choice of campaign, but she felt very strongly that women should be in the Home Guard on the same basis as men, in that they could actually handle arms, they could do anti-aircraft gun work and that sort of thing. And so she worked hard on this, and she had various meetings with the Army High Command, as it were, and she teamed up very much with Dame Helen Gwyn Vaughan, who was the head of the Women's Royal Army Corps, and they kind of worked together to try and get women in the Home Guard on the same basis as men. In fact, they weren't successful. It was a very long, hard-fought campaign, including a demonstration in Trafalgar Square. And I've got a picture in the book of Edith at the firing range in the House of Commons trying to make the point that women could actually do this. But women did never gain full recognition. They were eventually allowed to join the Home Guard. At the beginning of the war, they couldn't even join. They were allowed to join the Home Guard, but not on the same basis as men. They could, would you believe, do things like make the tea and those sorts of support functions. They didn't even have a uniform, which Edith wanted them to have, but they had a sort of medal they could wear. It was, after a lot of hard work, it was unfortunate, really unfortunate, it didn't go any further than that. But this particular campaign, I think, is very much a reflection of Edith herself. She took up campaigns, some with more success than others, which essentially were outside Parliament. I mean, she did the job in Parliament. She had tremendous energy. She did the job in Parliament, but she also took up these sort of extra parliamentary campaigns and worked very hard on them and actually got results, in a lot of cases, quite serious results. The other thing to do with women in the war was getting women to support the war effort and work in factories. I've certainly always picked up over the years seeing programmes on television and indeed reading books about the Second World War. You have this idea that women were whisked off to munitions factories and they just did it. In fact, it was a long, hard slog to get women working in factories. And it was only halfway through the war, really, that it was accepted, because a lot of the factory owners just didn't want women there. They didn't think women could do it. They didn't think women would have the stamina or the ability to do this kind of work. And so there was actually committee set up in 1940 by Winston Churchill called the Women Power Committee, which was made up largely of women MPs. And they fought very hard to get women involved in the war effort, particularly working for money in the war effort. Ernest Bevin, who was Minister of Labour then, took this up but didn't like the Women Power Committee, so he set up another committee called the Women's Consultative Committee. Edith was actually on both of them, and she was one of the main people pushing this, and it did actually happen. I think the campaign helped, but it became more and more unsustainable to have women out there but not really contributing in the way that they were able to, and it was really circumstances, as much as anything else, that got women in the munitions factories. There were actually two debates on women power in Parliament in March 1941 and March 1942. What Edith did in these debates was talk about the need for nurseries, and creches. Obviously, if the women were going out to work, they needed somewhere to put the children. And this was a campaign she continued for many years after the war. They did actually get set up and seemed to work quite well, except as soon as the war was over, the government closed them down to a very large extent, though Edith did continue, as I said, the campaign to keep them open. She also won equal campaign for equal compensation for war injuries. I mean, this is another unbelievable story of the time. At the time, until Edith actually got this agreed, men who were injured by bombing and other war injuries, not fighting industries, but civilian injuries, actually got more compensation than women, because it was believed that men were the breadwinners and should therefore get more money, which actually was in wartime was actually probably not quite the case, and it's quite wrong anyway. I mean, if you're hurt, you're hurt, and Edith made the point, but as if she'd actually been wounded in a bombing raid or something, the family would have been just as badly off as if her husband, who was also a professional, had been injured. So she did get that through. That was granted in 1943. The war wasn't really good for the family. Geoffrey, her husband, was joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, and the children were evacuated, and they moved around a bit. And Edith's surgery was bombed in 1941. She practiced until then. It was very bad. Obviously, it was a bad time for everybody, but it was bad on several levels for the Summerskill Samuel family. But what it did do, Edith had a long interest for many, many years in tuberculosis. Her father had actually run a TB clinic for a while, and it started her on a campaign to eradicate tuberculosis from the milk supply. And until she started doing this, there was no pasteurisation of milk. I mean, milk was just, actually that's not correct, there was some, but it was completely voluntary. So milk went out to everybody in its natural state. And one of the things that it carried was TB, and bovine TB was a particularly nasty sort of TB. So, and Edith did actually get that through. In 1949, she did actually get what was actually called, these things were always called such unbelievably boring titles. They're called the Milk Special Designations Act, but it was actually about pasteurisation and making sure that the milk supply was safe. After the war, there was a massive Labour majority in 1945, not particularly expected. And obviously Clement Attlee became the new Prime Minister, and Edith became Parliamentary Secretary at the Ministry of Food. I think she might have hoped that she might have been in the Cabinet setting up the National Health Service, because she spent many years in the 1930s being very active in the Socialist Medical Association, which campaigned for a state medical service. But as we all know, Anarian Bevin got that post instead, for reasons which best known to Clement Attlee, but probably because he wanted to, I think it was completely political. Attlee wanted to keep the left wing of the party on side, so he gave Bevin a serious senior post. I think Bevan was quite suited to it, but I think Edith was probably a bit disappointed. At Health, the Ministry of Food, she was basically the most junior minister there. When she first started, the cabinet minister was Ben Smith, who didn't last very long, who proved a bit of a disaster. And then he was succeeded by John Strachey. And Edith and John Strachey did not get on at all. I mean, you read between the lines, and it was quite seriously difficult. I mean, they came from very different backgrounds. Edith, actually being a doctor, knew about food and nutrition. Strachey had basically been, he'd written books for the Left Book Club, and he was basically a polemicist. I mean, he hadn't got a clue about what the ministry did. Edith's main job was rationing. Rationing existed throughout all this period and was not actually abolished finally for everything until 1954. And she was responsible for dealing with rationing, making sure it worked and selling it to the people of the country, because people were very fed up with rationing by this point. They'd had it all through the war, and they were living on, wealthy people actually found it much more difficult, because one thing that rationing did, it was massively redistributive, because people who were well off couldn't get a lot of the things like butter in quantities that they'd been used to it before, whereas people who weren't well off actually improved their diet because they were able to get more of those sorts of things and eat a rather better nutritious diet, which was an unforeseen but a very interesting spin-off from rationing. And towards the end of the time she was there, Edith decided that she needed to find some new foods because it was all getting difficult and people were getting very, very fed up. And one of the things that she introduced was snook. It's called S-N-O-E-K, and it's pronounced snook apparently. And it was the most ghastly thing. It was some sort of eel type thing and it came from South Africa. And it was tinned and brought to Britain. And there was a real push by the Ministry of Food to get people to eat it, and everybody hated it. It must have been one of the greatest food disasters ever. And there's this little rhyme which appeared in the Guardian, Manchester Guardian at the time. In Snook and Whale, about Edith, in Snook and Whale she made it plain, she found no hidden thrill. Indeed they made her summer wane and undermined her skill. When housewives worried how to fit such things for snacks and suppers, she worried too, since she should hit the parliamentary scuppers. In fact, she didn't. She survived all of that, but it was quite difficult at the time. And there were stories of ships full of this tins of stuff being left in the docks because nobody wanted to eat it. She had a bad experience too with margarine, which was introduced, which interestingly, and I didn't know this till I did this, is made from soap, derivatives from soap. So it wasn't on the ration, because soap wasn't rationed. So you could make as much margarine as you liked. I mean, it's one of those bizarre things. And Edith was convinced it tasted like butter. And I mean, Edith wasn't a great foodie, so I think that she didn't quite understand the effect these things have. And she actually took a challenge. It was held in Oxford, actually, in 1948. And she was invited, actually, to the Oxford University Labour Club to speak about technology of food, mainly about margarine. And she was challenged by one of the students, and she agreed to do a test with the student about telling the difference. She said she couldn't. And the Daily Express had been tipped off that this was going on, and it made front page news. And apparently the switchboard at the Ministry of Food was inundated with calls from housewives saying that they could tell the difference and they didn't really like margarine. So that was another food policy which didn't particularly work very well. But on the other hand, the whole idea of rationing did make the nation's diet better on the whole and allowed poor people to have much better, more nutritious food than they'd had before. So it wasn't all a complete disaster, but people were getting fed up with it. And bread became rationed a bit after this as well. So it didn't go away. If anything, rationing increased. There was a general election in 1950, which Labour just won very narrowly, and Edith became Minister for National Insurance. She introduced only for a very short time, because there was another general election in 1951. She introduced the pneumoconiosis and byssinosis benefit bill, which was basically to compensate miners who had lung diseases, and she also later moved the Workmen's Compensation Bill. And she was sent to India. She was asked by Ernest Bevin to go to Egypt to see conditions there and try and help Egypt, which was still under British protectorate, to put some sort of help them set up some sort of national insurance and health scheme, which was badly needed because Egypt was absolutely in dire poverty. And of course, that all under King Farouk, that all ended in 1952 when Farouk was deposed by Nasser, and that's a completely other story. She was also made a Privy Councillor at this point. I mean, she was becoming very senior and well known and respected. Then Labour lost the 1951 election, and she was elected to the Labour Party National Executive Committee. She had been elected actually in 1944, and she was on it until 1958 with a bit of a gap in the middle. It was important in opposition. The NEC of the Labour Party was a lot more powerful then than it is now, and it was particularly important in opposition. And she became a leading figure. Obviously, she was an MP and well thought of, and the way that the chairing the NEC and National Labour Party Conference worked then and still works is that it has a different chair. They called it chairman, then we call it chair, and a different chair every year. And Edith actually became chairman for the year 1954 to 55. And this was a really turbulent time for the Labour Party. I mean, the 1980s were bad. I think the 1950s may have been even worse. There was the whole thing about the bomb, the H-bomb, and testing the bomb, and the beginnings of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And these issues really split the Labour Party. And Aneurin Bevan was the voice of the left. I don't think he ever saw himself as the leader of the left, but he was the most prominent left-wing figure. And he actually behaved he was quite out of order in certain instances, and actually stood up in the Commons once and opposed Labour Party policy. So there was a movement then to at least get the whip withdrawn from Bevan, if not actually expel him. Edith chaired these sessions. This was the year when she was chair of the NEC. It took me a while to work this out because nobody ever, in any of the secondary sources I read, mentioned this, which is extraordinary given she had a prominent role, and absolutely none of the writers of any of the books mentioned this. Michael Foot, Kenneth Morgan, they're just not there. Anyway, I got there in the end, and she did actually chair this, and Bevan did actually have the whip withdrawn. Edith at this time had a total and utter disaster. She was still MP for Fulham West, and the seats of Fulham East and Fulham West merged due to boundary changes in the early 1950s. So when it came to contesting Fulham West in the 1955 election, she was up against the MP for Fulham East. The two had to fight it out between them. The MP for Fulham East was Michael Stewart, who later became Foreign Secretary in the Wilson government. He won it. And there was Edith, chair of the NEC, prominent member, without a seat. The trade unions and the Labour Party did actually come to her rescue, and she went up to Warrington. and she stayed MP for Warrington until she became a member of the House of Lords in 1961. She had a sort of interesting and quite difficult time in addition to this during the 1950s. She took up a campaign, as I mentioned earlier, about boxing, which was her campaign. Nobody else supported her in it. She wrote a book called The Ignoble Art in 1956. And it was an extraordinary thing to do because the British Medical Association didn't like boxing, and they were against it, but they didn't support her. Anyway, it sort of fizzled out, but did her no good at all. And after the Suez invasion, she decided that she would go to Suez to look at casualties, because there have been rumours floating around that the British forces had killed a lot of civilians. So she decided to go on a tour of Suez to find out about this. She was an NEC member, a shadow cabinet member now, and she didn't consult anyone. She just went off and did it. And it wasn't a very happy experience. She decided there were more casualties than the official reports had said. But she was massively attacked by the press when she came back. As you can well imagine, I mean, it was all over all the newspapers. And she also, during this time, when she was in Suez, she talked to a tour guide, and she was so ashamed of what had gone on that this tour guide asked her if she was English, and she said, "No, I'm Norwegian," which was, maybe you can say that to a tour guide in Egypt in the pyramids, but she then wrote in one of the London papers that that's what she said. And I mean, that was just extraordinary. And she had questions asked in the House of Commons by Tory members, and it really, really didn't actually do her any good at all. And it was very strange behaviour, actually. And I think she felt the loss of her seat very badly. I think she didn't have much of a position anymore. And I think she was just, you know, going out there and sort of really behaving in this kind of way. Anyway, she was in Warrington until 1961, when she went into the Lords. She'd done lots of work in the Commons about women, married women's property. There was a famous case in 1943 when she'd supported the Married Women's Association, supported a woman called Mrs. Blackwell, who had some savings of her own. The marriage broke up and she left the family home and obviously took with her savings. Her husband said they were his because that was the law at the time, and Edith fought the case and actually lost it on appeal. But Edith continued doing this sort of work, and when she was in the House of Lords, the Married Women's Property Act was actually passed, as was the Equal Pay Act in 1970. So and also she supported the Abortion Act, and she was active in the Lords until 1977, and 3 years before she died at the age of 79. And hers is an absolutely extraordinary story. She did all of this. She was a real pioneer for women. She had a cause. She stuck with it, never gave up. And she was an amazing woman. And you know, I hope that her story is going to be out there more now. More people are going to know about her and what she did and what she achieved. The Times obituary was absolutely. I mean, it's a very fitting tribute. This was a couple of days after she died, about Edith. The Times obituary called her a lively and public-spirited woman who will rank high among the women pioneers of the Labour Party. Went on to say, in all that she did, Edith Summerskill was supremely efficient, and if people sometimes winced at the sharpness of her tongue, they were soon conscious of the warm humanity behind the public image of the ardent feminist, this lively and public-spirited woman who will rank high among the women pioneers of the Labour Party. That was Edith Summerskill, an ardent feminist, high in the public image and in the Labour Party.
so much, Mary.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was so interesting. And as you say, she is the most kind of extraordinary individual. And actually, quite a lot of the things that you've talked about are so kind of characteristic of the things that have been coming up throughout the conference. So one of the other things that come up is, what do women need in order to be able to participate in politics? And the husband is just absolutely central to that, isn't it? And he's particularly unusual in not only quote unquote allowing his wife to keep her married, but the children also take Summerskill, not Samuel, which is really, really interesting. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was expertise. I think the thing about one of the things that Estelle Morris said, which I was really struck by, is you have to kind of, if you're a woman in politics, you have to develop kind of thick enough skin to be able to kind of withstand the things that are thrown at you, but you have to also be able to take criticism and to know when that criticism is legitimate. And I'm not quite sure, from what you said, that Edith Summerskill ever quite got that balance right, that she wasn't able to really sort of understand when some of the criticism actually was like a fair point. And in some ways she seems to be sort of characteristic of that post-war period of like expertise, top down, I know best, it's kind of politics of expertise that is kind of really embedded in all of it. But she seems to embody that for me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And of course she was a doctor at the time when that's very much how doctors were. So I think she was trained to do this from quite an early age, which I think did make a difference. And she was always very conscious of being a doctor and a professional woman. And she quite often handed people out bits of medical advice, quite unsolicited quite often. It was something that she did. But I think the world was very top down then. I mean, that's actually just how everything worked. Having said that, though, I mean, the Labour Party itself was a much more working class organisation then, but it through the trade union movement mainly. But of course, they were people, men almost entirely, who had come up through the movement, and then I think perhaps in order to do that, had to be very sort of aggressive in many instances, and then when they got there, adopted a top-down attitude because they felt they knew about it, and that's how you got on in those days. So I think, yes, I think Edith was like that, but I think it was very much a product of her time. And she was, a rare, there were so few women. I think women just had to behave as if they were very strong. They had to be very strong, and they had to be very assertive. If you didn't get anywhere, and it was bad enough getting listened to anyway. And Edith faced tremendous discrimination and misogyny. Richard Crossman in his diaries referred to her as a numbskull, would you believe? I mean, and Gateskill called her an Amazon and Gorgon. I mean, she had put up with really quite heavy-duty insults. So you're right that women really needed a thick skin, and you just had to develop it or give up, I think.
And it's interesting that the names you mentioned there, it's her own people.
Yeah.
And that's that's something that comes across very strongly in Harriet Harman's own memoirs as well. I'm conscious that Mary's given us a lot of her time, and I'm conscious that you will have a very long day, especially Jakob at the back, who's been an absolute legend. Well, okay, great. like any woman at a conference should be. But I would like to open up to questions if anybody has any for Mary.
Thanks very much, Mary, for a brilliant, really interesting lecture. I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about Summerskill's views of the Attlee government. As you said, obviously she served as the minister in the government, so I guess she was in one sense a supporter of the government who would have made a case for it. But there was also a sense from what you were saying that she was aware of the limitations of the government. For example, the efforts that she went to promote the issue of childcare, which weren't that successful. So I just wondered, is there a sense from looking at Summerskill's life of a kind of emerging critique of the limitations of the Attlee government? I think now we see it, obviously, it tends to be seen in conventional historiography as a kind of pioneering landmark government, but I think there's also an acceptance that this was a government that had many limitations, and we see that played out in the 1950s, not least in the struggle of Labour to appeal to some women because of the agenda that it followed in the 40s. So I just wonder if you've got any reflections on, was there in Summerskill's contribution a sense of an acknowledgement of the limitations of Labourism in this period? Thanks.
Not in anything she said publicly or in her memoirs. I mean, she was incredibly loyal. I mean, as ministers often, usually are, I mean, have to be really. I mean, there is always a sense of collective responsibility. So you don't find her criticising the government openly, though obviously the childcare thing. I mean, she would often talk about her own, particularly about women, and when it came to talking about things like married women and property, and wanting legislation on those kinds of things. I mean, she would absolutely be completely outspoken about that, and but it didn't really, because it was complete. I mean, this has been the case about women's issues in the Labour Party always. It's quite separate from the party and the government in a lot of ways. So she could do that without anyone getting upset about it, because it was something which she was campaigning about, which was okay, and the government could potentially do if they wanted to. So that was really, I think, where she channeled a lot of that into her work on women and women, you know, property and women's rights and that kind of thing. She also continued to do a lot about maternity provision, which was a bit more where the government was at this time. And she did have quite a big argument. It was quite a serious argument, actually, with Aneurin Bevan about analgesia. I'll say this word, analgesia in childbirth, because this was a continuing campaign of hers, which went on after the National Health Service was set up, and she thought she got a promise out of Bevan that there would be more provision in hospitals, but she didn't, because Bevan didn't, and the Conservatives supported this. Bevan didn't want it because he thought, I mean, this is extraordinary, but he thought that the Conservatives were supporting analgesia in childbirth because they wanted money to be taken away from most of what the NHS did, and he saw it as a move to undermine the NHS. I mean, you know, so she did sometimes, on her own issues, actually criticise the government and campaign against the government. But it was on, I mean, that's important, an important matter and important to women, but it wasn't seen as a massive issue in the scheme of things. So she would do, but she was very careful how she did it.
Thanks very much. Apologies, I missed the first couple of minutes, so hopefully you didn't answer this, and I may risk the ire of the feminist gender historians in the room. But I'm really interested in your comments, reflections on the sort of the politics of which Labour women get biographies and which don't, and whether there's something in the pioneering bit of your title that explains why she didn't, or is it something in her life, or is it the times that maybe explains why she's not been subject to a biography previously? You know, was it that she didn't, because she wasn't in the diaries and biographies of others, that people left her? Is it just that there aren't enough historians around to do all the work that we need to be done, in the same way we can't, all the political scientists can't do all the political science on gender and politics that we want done too? Or is it something about the fact that she was, I mean, the word used earlier was feisty, or here we might think idiosyncratic or somewhat isolated. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what you think, having written a biography, that maybe explains the fact that you needed to, if I've understood when I walked into the room? Thank you.
Well, part of it's the obvious point, there weren't very many of them. So, I mean, Edith was very prominent, and she was an obvious gap. A lot of the early women MPs had marginal seats and were not there for very long. The ones who really were and became well known, Margaret Bomfield Ellen Wilkinson, and obviously later Barbara Castle. The really prominent ones have had biographies, and I think it's a combination of all of those things. I'm not sure now of this particular period. It gets a bit different when you get to the 60s and onwards. I'm not sure there are many other Labour women who were sort of prominent enough and did enough to merit a biography. I think we've maybe almost got to the end of the road there. I think there's merit in looking at whether something can be done about them, perhaps collectively rather than individually. I mean, someone who's been in Parliament for 2 or 3 years, unless they've had a really interesting life outside Parliament, it's quite difficult to make a book out of it. So I think that is partly due to it, the reason. And you're right. I mean, none of the women... I mean, Ellen Wilkinson features in some of the stuff that was written at the time. Margaret Bonfield, obviously, earlier as Minister of Labour, and then because she joined Ramsay MacDonald, the national government, she gets treatment. But I think it's more a reflection that there weren't that many women around at the time, rather than lack of people writing books.
But one of the things I found interesting actually in my own work is how many of them have left their own unpublished autobiography. So Caroline Ganley, Irene White, Joyce Butler, they've all got this material and it just kind of hasn't come forward. So I think the more that we can do to bring that forward and to talk about these women collectively, because I think there is something about exceptional women as opposed to the kind of collective that we need to understand more.
Yeah. I thought there was a biography of Josephine Butler.
Sorry, did I say Josephine Butler? I meant Joyce Butler.
Joyce, yes, right, yeah. Yes, I think that's true. I mean, all sorts of male politicians get biographies, better or for worse. I think there's, I think that there certainly is a lot more that we should be doing, and making, getting these women known, because so many of them aren't, and they should be really for what they did. So yeah.
Well, I very much hope we can continue this conversation in a more sociable and relaxed manner. Thank you all for persevering through the whole thing. Well done. It was a long